Welcome to A Closer Look at Storytelling, a little brain science. I'd like to begin with a recap of the video by Paul Zak, a neuroscientist. That video begins with a short animated story about young Ben, a child who is dying of cancer, and his father who struggles with his feelings as he plays with Ben day to day, knowing that his son does not have long to live. Then we get to learn about the other people who watched this story in a scientific study which measured how their brains responded to the story. The people felt distress and empathy when they watched the story, and this corresponded to increased levels of cortisol and oxytocin released by the brain. The study goes on to show that not only were there changes in the brain, but there were changes in the behavior of the participants. When offered the opportunity, people were moved by the story to want to take action that would help others. The same thing did not happen when in that study they watched a video of a father and son at the zoo. There was no engaging story, and there was no effect or change in people's brains who participated. So this scientific study was a way of measuring how actually the difference between the effects of a story that is engaging and the effects of a story that is not. Paul Zak, the scientist who ran this study and created this video, goes on to he says that the science of this confirms really what we know intuitively, that stories are powerful because they transport us into other people's worlds. And he highlights the dramatic arc that is part of an engaging story that includes the elements of exposition, rising action, climax, falling action, and resolution. So I thought it would be helpful to take an episode from the story of Baha'u'llah to look at how this story arc might look like in something that we're familiar with. And I chose for my story the story of Mirza Yahya and Baha'u'llah in Adrianople. So the first element of the story arc is exposition, which is really setting the scene. Who are the characters? Where does it take place? And a brief bit of background to orient the listener. So in this case, Mirza Yahya and Baha'u'llah are the prime characters, and the background that we need to know is simply that Mirza Yahya for a long time has had aspirations for leadership of the Baha'i community. He has had great jealousy of Baha'u'llah, and on Baha'u'llah's part, he's been very forbearing of Mirza Yahya and looked at him with a sin-covering eye. So this is the setting of the scene. The next element of the dramatic arc is rising action, which it begins with a conflict or complication. Often it has an inciting incident that triggers the action, sets the action in motion. In this story, the inciting incident is Mirza Yahya's attempt on the life of Baha'u'llah. That certainly sets the action in motion. And then the story builds with more complications. So Mirza Yahya, when that fails, takes other steps to try to have someone else kill Baha'u'llah. Mirza Yahya claims to have received a revelation from God in response to a tablet from Baha'u'llah that tells him in no uncertain terms that he, Baha'u'llah, is the manifestation. Then we have the most great separation, in which Baha'u'llah withdraws from the company of the Baha'i believers. And during this 2-month time period, the Baha'is sort themselves out into who are the faithful Baha'is from those who are not. And when that period ends, Sayyid Muhammad is expelled from the Baha'i community by Baha'u'llah for the protection of that community. So all of this, all of these things that happen are steps in a rising action as the story builds tension. Then we reach the climax. And what is this? Well, Mir Muhammad comes to town and persuades Mirza Yahya to have a public debate with Baha'u'llah. You might say this is part of the rising action. The climax comes when when Mirza Yahya accepts that, and Mir Muhammad delivers the message from Mirza Yahya to Baha'u'llah. So here we have a decisive moment or turning point, which defines what is a climax. Because surprisingly, Baha'u'llah answers and accepts the challenge. And not only does he accept it, but he immediately leaves his home, walks through the town, and at this point, people have heard about the news of the public debate that's going to happen. So people have come out and they're watching to see what is happening. And Baha'u'llah walks with majesty and power to the mosque of Sultan Salim. He waits there for a long time, and Mirza Yahya never shows up. So at the end of the day, everyone, it is clear that Baha'u'llah has won the day in the minds of everyone there. That is the climax. From that point on, the rising action now becomes falling action. The falling action is the next element of the story arc. It's all that happens after as the result of the climax. So in this case, what happens? Baha'u'llah writes a tablet to Mirza Yahya with the conditions for a new meeting between the two of them. But Mirza Yahya must accept the conditions in order for this meeting to take place. Mirza Yahya, on his part, does not accept the conditions. So this leads us to the next element of the story arc, which is resolution. Baha'u'llah expels Mirza Yahya from the company of Babis. Why does he do it now and not earlier? Because it's at this point that Mirza Yahya has, in a very public way, set himself against the faith. And so Baha'u'llah expels him as a protection for the faith itself. And then we have the denouement, or any remaining resolutions. And in this story, the Babis now take on a new name. They become Baha'is. So that is our example of a story arc. You might think of this story arc in relation to the story's beginning, middle, and end. So the beginning of the story is, of course, your setup, exposition, and the initial problem, conflict, or inciting incident. That's at the beginning. The middle of your story is everything that's part of the rising action and finally leads to the climax. And then the end of the story is the falling action and resolution. Now, if all of that seems a little complicated, until you become familiar with it, you might think of this simpler approach to a story arc in a few questions. What sets the story in motion? What happens next? Where does the story change? And what is resolved at the end? These are helpful questions as you're organizing your story, and they can also be really helpful as you practice your story with others. So you have a friend or a small group. If each of you helps with responding to the story and seeing, well, where did that story really begin? And are you getting to that beginning early enough? You know, are you giving us maybe a little too much backstory, and maybe you just need to get that story moving? And then what happens next, and where does that story take a change? What is resolved at the end of it? Of course, all of this is in service to the goal of the storyteller creating a connection with the listener, of bridging the heart and mind, and of the ultimate story goal of make me care. Now, before we leave this little video on a little brain science, I want to add one last note, and that is, however useful and interesting it is to find out what the physical brain does in response to an engaging story, I want us to remember as Baha'is that the physical brain is not to be equated with the mind. In Baha'i writings, the mind is considered in a larger context. And I think this really lovely passage from some answered questions by Abdu'l-Baha helps to show us more about what the mind is from a Baha'i perspective. It's more than the physical brain. Abdu'l-Baha says this: as for the mind, it is the power of the human spirit. The spirit is as the lamp, and the mind as the light that shines from it. The spirit is as the tree, and the mind as the fruit. The mind is the perfection of the spirit, and a necessary attribute thereof, even as the rays of the sun are an essential requirement of the sun itself. And with that, I wish you well in your story practice, and we'll meet you at our next video.